All right, as we have been looking at 1 Peter up to now, in the first chapter, we have Peter expressing the idea of the inheritance that we have and rejoicing in that, which is protected by God and made possible through Jesus Christ, through our rebirth. And he makes the point that our trials are a test of our faith, and that those trials should be making us stronger. And the salvation that, in fact, we believe that we have in Christ, that was prophesied. That was prophesied hundreds of years before Jesus came. So prepare your mind for action. Be holy as Christ was. Conduct yourself in fear. Who are we to be fearing? According to Peter. God. I mean, there are plenty of reasons for them at this time to be fearing the local authorities. These are people who have been dispersed because of the persecutions. Now, whether they were Jews dispersed from Judea, Gentiles dispersed from Rome, I mean, wherever it might have been. We don't know exactly when Peter wrote this letter. But either way, they have faced opposition. Peter knows that, and he's writing to them about that. And finally, he describes them being born again of imperishable seed. What's the significance of being born of imperishable seed? Okay. You want to elaborate on that a little bit, Nathan?
Some translations use, of course, the word incorruptible.
Okay.
And being born of an imperishable or incorruptible seed, means that there's something better there. The core of it is better. And so that's what we need to, of course, strive for, is to be as good as that core, and to surround ourselves, even by those that are like that, and like to want to have the same, outcome, if you will.
Okay. So, if we take and put a pumpkin seed in the ground, if we're lucky and don't have a completely black thumb, we'll get a vine, which will ultimately produce a few little pumpkins, or maybe just one little pumpkin. And that vine will come fall be, destroyed by the frost, and it'll die. If you leave the pumpkin out in the pumpkin patch, it's going to get soft, it's going to, essentially die. And so that is the nature of things of this world. They're born, they live, and they die. But the thing that Peter wants them to remember is that we have been recreated, we have been born again of ever-living seed. And even though physically we will die, our spiritual existence will not. And so, again, that's a major point for Peter in chapter 1. So as we go to chapter 2, let's go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk about it further. And coming to him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value, then, is for you who believe. But for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected this became the very cornerstone, and the stone of stumbling, and the rock of offense. For they stumbled because they were disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were also appointed. Now, of course, he's talking about Jesus Christ as being a cornerstone. So we need to take maybe a step back, and how can Jesus be a cornerstone for us? Yes, Branch.
He wants to live by what he said. His guide, rules that guide him. He wants to be a follower.
Okay.
And when that seed that becomes perishable, that's when we want to go seed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, imperishable then. But following him, his rules, I mean, that's every stone now to me.
Okay. Yep. Peter now has switched to metaphors about a temple and about priesthood. And these people would have thought of a temple as a building, right? So if you were erecting a building, maybe not so much now, but back then, why was the cornerstone important? Yes.
Today, a cornerstone just is a place to record the building date and place. But earlier on, I used to work for a block layer.
Mm-hmm.
Cornerstone was the first block you laid down.
Yeah.
From that corner block, you went all the two directions to make the angle. If that block was off, then the wall was off. But the cornerstone is the first and most important stone in the building.
And you'd have your level lines probably going out both directions
Exactly.
from that cornerstone. So how does this relate to how we as Christians relate to Christ? I mean, French covered a significant part of it, but let's keep it maybe within the metaphor.
It's foundational.
Okay. So,
Paul used the same analogy
yeah.
about construction and what men try to build with and the materials that they use. But it still has to conform to the layout. But when the time comes and the testing comes, it will be tested and to see whether it's going to remain.
Okay.
So the point is, he laid it out for those who believe in him. And as French pointed out, it has to be followed. You've got to follow the direction in which it was laid out.
Okay. Certainly from a doctrinal standpoint, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. Becky?
Well, I agree with what David said, but also, isn't it also that we are part of the church, we're part of the whole structure, and
Okay.
it's only because, it's not because of us, because we're sinners, and even though we're trying to follow God, we're still sinners. But the Lord has forgiven us and allowed us in his mercy to become a part of this whole spiritual
Okay.
structure.
All right. Well, as we were talking about before, when you put, you've got the foundation down, which today, helps you in guiding where to build. But back then, when you put that stone down, you identify what are the two angles, out from that corner. And at least today, I'm not sure about the building practices back then, but you're also looking at what is the level. If you're building with uniform blocks and you're putting down another block and another block and another block, do you want one of the blocks to be higher and one of the blocks to be lower and then the cornerstone? No. You want them all to be uniform. So, if you will, all the blocks are looking at that cornerstone to determine how and where, what they are supposed to be. And, David, tied it to doctrine, which is appropriate. But I think you need to tie it to Jesus himself as well. How did Jesus behave?
It's about his behavior, but also fundamentally what he said.
Okay, it's both. Jesus taught by, lessons, but he also taught by example. And so we need to be looking at both and making sure that we are conforming ourselves. We can, again, there's an extreme, there's, church, quote unquote, doctrine, which may or may not be correct. There are the teachings of the inspired writers, which we know are correct. And even more so, there's an example of a human being who showed us. Now, of course, we're not the Son of God. We can't be. Do all of the things he did. Now, a lot of people get...
Is in word and deed.
Okay.
Word and deed. Jesus showed us deeds and his law. And that's pretty much what all the apostles are teaching. Whatever you do in word and deed,
Yeah.
do what? All in the name of the Lord.
Okay. So, if you think about your behavior, if you tend to fly off the handle and get angry, you look back at the example of Jesus. Did Jesus ever get angry? Yeah. But under what circumstances? And with what, effect? And secondly, a kind of the negative question. What happens if Jesus is not our cornerstone?
You're not stable.
Well, you're not where you're supposed to be, at least, right?
Those who don't believe him will be offended by it. In other words, they would be caused to fall.
Okay.
It will be an attack to them.
But let's take it even further. Again, remember that Peter is building up, his metaphor here is a temple. Now, we've shown some pictures of some of the Greek temples that were common. Some of them are pretty elaborate structures, even though, they're showing some of the ravage of time. If you think about Herod's temple in Jerusalem, it was a magnificent temple, very large temple. Matter of fact, you even have an account of the gospel of the apostles, showing Jesus all the magnificence that was there. Of course, that was before he told them that, it was all going to be torn down. So they understood the idea of a temple, and it not being just, this plain elaborate, simple building. It was usually as fancy as the people could afford to build. And so we are, as he's going to say, part of that building, part of that temple, but that temple is built starting from the cornerstone, moving out. So if you're not aligned with the cornerstone, are you really going to be part of that temple? If cornerstone's here and you see two walls, one going that way and one going that way, and you're over here, are you part of that temple? No.
There's a stone in Herod's temple that's about 45 or 50 feet long. It's 10 feet square. It weighs 570 tons. And it's the largest, heaviest anything that the ancient people ever moved.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody told me that had been there that you can't even take a hardly piece of paper and fit it between these stones. They're so square, level, and true. And that's kind of reminiscent of the chief cornerstone. That chief cornerstone had to be exactly exact. We always think of them as being primitive builders, but that's just not true. They had water levels and other tools that made them capable of building things very, very precisely.
And because the construction could last for years and years, and sometimes generations, they would take the time to get the surfaces right. But, that brings up really another point about the cornerstone, and that is, of all the stones that your, masons or stoneworkers are going to work on to make the surfaces of that stone true and all the angles right, the cornerstone is the one that's going to be the most perfect. It has to be. And of course, that represents Jesus Christ. But continuing here, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. All right, so here he continues with the idea of, this temple. So, how does being a Christian make us strangers and pilgrims? Or, let's start, how did it make these first century Christians strangers and pilgrims?
Well, it certainly were strange to the people who were observing their behavior. They were considered unique people,
Mm-hmm.
different from everybody else. If they were following what Christ taught, their heart was not set on the things of the world.
Okay.
There was only one thing that they were concerned about doing, and that was glorifying God through Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they should do.
So, a stranger, in this particular case, you're not a current resident. In our parlance, you're an alien. Pilgrim. What's a pilgrim? Yeah. You're traveling on to another destination.
They even had John Wayne fans in those days.
Okay. No comment there. All right. An important question, and again, we want to first look at it from the first century standpoint. Peter writes that they are slandered as evildoers. What beliefs and behaviors, were considered evil by others in the first century?
I forget what that, I remember one time you brought up, and I think you and maybe someone else had that letter. I think we can get something out of that.
Okay.
That letter, what was the, one of the Sumerians or somebody, he was supposed to go out.
He was a governor in, it wasn't Galatia. And the name will come to me. I didn't think of it to put it in here.
But it's what he called them. It rings true. He called them haters of humanity. perceive them as haters of humanity because of what Peter is about ready to tell them they need to abstain from. I believe that's why it's the same notion you hear today, where I'm just human, or it's just natural. Yeah, that's probably true. But you need to abstain from those things if you want to live. Because that's what causes the evils in the world. And I believe I think that's what he's talking about.
Well, I think the first one and the biggest one was the fact that they did not participate in the idolatrous worship that was, prevalent around them. In fact, in Ephesus, it triggered a riot, right? Because all the silversmiths, got together and, these Christians, they're just turning the world upside down because, if they keep teaching about Jesus and rejecting Diana, no one's going to purchase, the silver figurines and whatever we make because no one will worship in the temple of Diana. That's sort of, from their perspective, turning the world upside down. That's making them, antisocial. From the Roman perspective, Roman emperors kind of flirted with the idea of their own godhood. Certainly, it was more typically accepted that, well, at least you worship the previous emperors as being deities. Did Christians do this? No. Why not? Because their worship was dedicated to one true God. So, again, their actions are separating them from the rest of mankind. There were multiple charges about them, including the charge of being cannibals. Where do you think that charge came from?
Jesus said. He said it was probably based on the memorial.
Mm-hmm.
Remembrance of his death.
Yeah.
Eating his flesh and drinking his blood.
And most societies abhor cannibals. So there were all of these charges. How many people really believe that? I mean, I don't know. But many, I'm sure, for other reasons, were looking for, reasons to, downgrade, to make charges against Christians in their area. And so they didn't fit in. They didn't conform to many of the accepted standards. I want to say all, but they did not conform to many of the accepted standards. And this marked them. And for a while, many were given the alternative. Well, if you just renounce this Jesus Christ and worship, the emperor, then, we'll forget all about this. And of course, there were enough that did not to lead to substantial persecutions. So, that was the problem in the first century. Are there problems similar to that today? Becky?
Yes, there's a lot of, as society changes, we don't, as a society, have the standard of Scripture, and so suddenly we begin to evolve. What practices are going to be acceptable that used to be taboo, but now they're acceptable, and then suddenly Christians come along and no, they think that's still evil regardless, and because of that, the Christians are considered to be the ones that are evil and not understanding, not loving, and not accepting of the way things really are. And that's happening quite a lot right now.
Yeah, you're hateful because you don't accept whatever XYZ, issue, freedom, deviancy, or whatever it might be. So,
A stone, a stumbling, and a rock and a thorn. There's two ways that somebody who hears the gospel will respond to the general. If they believe what they heard, they will recognize it in themselves, and they will obey. And want to do what is right inside of God.
yeah.
And the other way is, you're an offense to me. I don't like what you're saying, the things you're teaching, and you're offending me. That's fundamentally the way
Yeah.
it generally will work.
And unfortunately today, many have lost the acceptance that you can have rational arguments and essentially evaluate your position and someone else's position based on logic and based on evidence rather than emotion. I mean, that's always been a problem, but it is much, much bigger problem in my opinion. And the question is here, does verse 12 give hope? And if so, how? Is this a hopeless battle? Yes, sir.
He says that they speak against you as evildoers, the world does. But through your good deeds, you cause them to glorify God on the day of visitation. If they remain sinners, they won't be glorifying God when God visits them. I think he's talking about the day they're visited with the gospel. If they watch your example and they learn from you, then someday when they're approached with the gospel, they'll respond to it and glorify God because of what they've seen you do. That's the day of visitation.
So in other words, you keep hitting them with kindness. You keep hitting them with, righteous behavior. And every society, tends to recognize and praise selflessness, patience, kindness, all of the things that we as Christians should be demonstrating. So Peter presents a way to overcome the prejudices and the opposition of those around him. Is it going to work on everyone? No, he's not promising that at all. And we know historically it didn't work on everyone. But it can lead to others accepting the gospel and being saved. Yes, Diana.
I think too, if you look at the times, the Roman citizenship and how important that was. If you were under scrutiny as a Christian, if they were to see that as, if they were to see your actions as, a citizenship of somewhere else, somewhere higher, a heavenly citizenship, I can totally see where this could happen. That does give hope. They're really scrutinizing what you're doing.
Now, it took several hundred years, but ultimately the Roman population changed, their attitude. Of course, it was helped along by a few emperors who, pushed in that direction. But Christians were a minority, and I would suggest a small minority. But yet, their influence was sufficient that all of the persecutions could not wipe it out.
And, John,
Yes.
and also, not just, it's me again, but these things being repeated by talks about Christians. They keep saying it over and over and over, and people standing off to the side hear it. And they may want to explore that, see what it is they're talking about. And the next thing you know, we've got one more new Christian.
Mhm.
So that's, it's got to be a plus to it somewhere.
Yeah, it is important to recognize, I don't think Peter is talking, hey, you're going to be able to overcome and convince all of the people that are persecuting you, and you're not face persecution anymore. I don't think he's saying that. What he is saying is if you remain faithful, if you do these things, there are going to be some who recognize the truth behind what you're doing. And that's what's important, and that's what we should be expecting. Now, the workbook had several questions, so let's look at them real quickly. Christians are to serve as priests who offer spiritual sacrifices to God. And, subset of that is every sacrifice that is dubbed spiritual, acceptable to God. Why or why not? And what are these spiritual sacrifices that God expects us to offer to Him? What did you have down in your books? Or what, if you didn't have a book, what were your conclusions on this?
It's the same thing Paul
Yeah, there's some agreement there.
said. More details there. But it's our lives, if we do what is right, then, and denying the lust of the flesh, that's offering up a holy sacrifice.
Okay.
Because we're doing what is right in the sight of God, no matter what. And up to and including, if that means that I'm going to be persecuted for it, then that is going to be my sacrifice. Jesus' sacrifice was one where he was nailed to a cross because he did nothing to hurt anyone, but tell the truth, and all he did was good.
Well, he was going to hurt people.
Well, the hurt, that's right, but that's why I'll say, the stone of stumbling and the rock
Uh-huh.
if people will not be condemned to hear the gospel because he wanted it, it's because they didn't want it. If that makes sense.
He presented an obstacle to their own objectives and desires.
And that was because of the sin that they wouldn't let loose.
And, the wording here that Peter uses, want everyone to recognize, he pulls so many things and so many ideas out of the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 19, and you can look at Deuteronomy for similar passages. You shall say, to the house of Jacob, and he'll tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all of the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. Not terribly different than what Peter is saying here. And the idea of a spiritual sacrifice. I always come back to this one. After Paul has spent, 11 chapters talking about how Christianity and the gospel is better than the Jewish law, and how the nation of Israel, many of them have turned their back on Jesus, and God is right to judge them. So he's written all of this, and now he said, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And of course, in chapter 12 and 13, he goes on to describe the behavior in which Christians should engage in. And I've emphasized it some, but do you think about your daily behavior as this is how I worship God?
Our very existence should be in worship to God, because we now are guided by the words of Jesus.
And for a Jew, of course, I don't know if this predominantly Jews that Peter's writing to, but for a Jew, when you talk about the superiority of Jesus Christ in the gospel, well, what about the priest? What about the sacrifices? I mean, before, I understood I was supposed to bring this sacrifice to the high priest, or to the priest, and the high priest would offer it. What am I supposed to do now? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to behave in a godly way. That's better than any number of animals that you can take to the temple.
There is something we have to stand. It's of the flesh.
Well, so that's me putting to death, the desires. That's probably not the best word, because I'm not sure the desires ever are completely gone away. But we resolve not to think and act on them. Second question, kind of zipping along here because our time's going away. Why do some people see the priceless value of Christ as in a precious cornerstone, while others see him as useless and contemptible? What factors determine those judgments?
Some people don't believe that there's any way for them to be saved and be spiritual in the first place.
Okay.
They don't believe in heaven. God. So he's not choosing.
So if you are predisposed not to believe in the supernatural, that there are things which you can't taste and touch and feel, what are you going to think about the gospel? I mean, there are centuries of scholarship of people approaching, studying the Bible, believing that miracles cannot happen, no one can be raised from the dead, and as a result, all of this must be fake, and wrote their commentaries and lessons and papers on those assumptions. And if you approach it that way, is it going to do you any good? One of the passages that was identified is in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discretion of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preached to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weaknesses of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brethren. Not many of you are wise according to worldly standards. Not many are powerful. Not many are of noble birth. But God chose the foolish in the world to shame the wise. And God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Now, how did God choose the foolish in the world? And how did God choose the shame, the weak in the world?
If we look at the Sermon on the Mount, as he say, blessed is who? Each person, all those people would have been people who were within the dregs of the world. To the world, they're nothing. But the really smart people and the ones who's got all the power and wisdom and understanding, but God gave it to those who would have understood.
So Jesus Christ was not that acceptable to the Sanhedrin, not acceptable to the leading Pharisees, not acceptable to the priest. I mean, there were few exceptions, but by and large, they did not accept him. It was, the fishermen and the farmers and the shepherds and all of those that were, low class, if you will, because they were willing to go see his miracles. There are other passages too, which, I'm not going to try to read, but, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 continues on with that. And do want to cover this in John chapter 8. Let's skip on down here. Why do you not understand? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. And when he lies, he speaks of his own character, for he is a liar and father of lies. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Now, who's he talking about? The Pharisees that he was condemning because they would not accept him. All right, question 3. Christians often regard being called by God as referring merely to their personal salvation. But that's not really how Peter is using this. Some translations use we were called to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us. So we are called to fulfill a ministry. So how do we do that?
Sharing the word.
Okay, then what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to follow it.
Well, there's an old saying that you hear so many times about talk the talk and you better walk the walk. That's basically what you just said.
I mean, the passage that he's referring to is describing the nature of the kingdom, as a temple. How does this temple proclaim itself? Why should people pay attention to it? How is it going to, what's going to initially cause the interest in that temple? In Matthew chapter 5, again, part of the Beatitude. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. We often use this to talk about, we need to go out and evangelize. And there's nothing wrong with going out and evangelizing. Don't get me wrong. But underneath or foundation to that evangelism needs to be our behavior. That temple should look outstanding because the righteous behavior of the stones that are built in it. All right, our time is gone, and thank you very much for your comments.